I should have walked around and looked at the other classes because I don't know if we don't if we're light this morning because nobody's here or because they're all going to other classes, and that's okay. I was going to start off this morning plugging other classes. There are this is the start of a new quarter, and so there are new classes starting. For those of you at home, if you've thought about coming to class, let me give you a rundown of what's happening. We will still be in here walking through Matthew. And so if you've thought about coming to church, but you've been worried about social distancing, you've been worried about being around people, right now we have this whole auditorium, and there's maybe, 15 people in here? I think that may be a high number. So my point is, you can social distance as much as you want to. And so if you're looking for a way to ease back in, come to class and hang out here, and then you can leave. And we'll even make sure you get communion before you leave. And you'll miss the preacher, but he's long-winded anyway, so you don't need that. So that's for all the people at home. If you're thinking about easing back in, it's a good way to do it. We will be in here doing Matthew. That's this class. In classroom C, I believe it is. Anybody know? Jacob, do you know? Is it C? Or C is Larry. No? B is Larry. So classroom B is Larry Wells going through the Old Testament. That's a more intimate setting. They're going to do a little bit more, discussion and have a little bit more. We try to do it in here, but this room is not real conducive to discussion. I mean, we get that. So if you want a more intimate setting, that's classroom B. And then the new classes are where? Do you remember? Help me out, Jacob. E? C. C. Classroom C, we're doing something, we're trying an experiment is what we're doing. And because we decided that one of the things that we, being the education committee, decided that we wanted to try to reach people where they're at. And getting people to class on a Sunday morning is sometimes an issue. And that's not just for us, that's for all churches. So what we're doing is we're gonna reach people where they're at. We're gonna give them practical, real world things that they need. There's going to be classes that do financial management, how to manage your money, how to understand credit, how to understand investing and growing your money. And I mean, I don't know, some of y'all, that's like, well, that's a no-brainer. People like me, that's just, I have no idea about any of that. It's like sorcery. It's magic. It just happens, and I don't have anything to do with it. But there's going to be some people who are skilled in that who are going to explain that. They're going to do some classes on estate planning. We're going to have actual legal lawyer who is going to talk to you about how to plan for the future and wills and some of us are getting to an age where our parents are starting to get older, and I'm having to try to understand things like power of attorney and all that stuff, and I don't understand it, and I don't know what to do with all that. That is going to be a value. And so on and on and on. There's a lot of other things going on. You can check that out on your own. I don't want to waste a bunch of our time on it. But they're going to have a scriptural tint to those classes. It's not going to be totally just secular stuff. But it's going to be real world stuff that we all need that, quite frankly, in our world, not a lot of people teach. They don't teach that in school anymore, I mean, we used to have classes where they taught us life skills, and now they don't really teach. I mean, I guess, Evan, you teach life skills, but it's a different thing than what I'm talking about. But my point is, there's a lot of people coming up, and we're like, well, we don't know what to do with that. How do I do that? So hopefully, that flies and becomes a thing. As I say that, if you've got things in the back of your mind and you're like, hey, I could teach a class on something, let me know, because there's always going to be openings for that. And so you may have thought, well, I can't teach Matthew, but I can teach this. I mean, whatever your thing is. And so think about that. Is that all of them? Am I missing anything, Jacob? That's the new classes on Sunday morning. And so, if you've been thinking about whether you want to be in class or not, I encourage you, show up. You might enjoy it. So this morning we're back in Matthew. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 16. It's been a minute since we were doing this, and so I know we've all slept since then. I know Freddie did a great job, and so one of the great things about having resources like Freddie is that I can be gone and I don't worry about it. You know what I mean? I don't worry about, is he going to say something that I'm upset about? Is he going to say something I'm going to have to come back and fix? Is he going to mess up? I trust Freddie, and so I don't even worry about it. And that's a blessing. A lot of preachers don't have that. And that's a big deal. So having Freddie here last week was a blessing, and I hope that if you weren't here, that is still going to be available online. Is that correct, Steve? Yes, that is going to be available online. So if you want to go back and check that out, you want to be like, well, what did Freddie talk about? I'm interested in hearing about prison ministry. Go check that out. So this morning, we're in Matthew 16. We're going to start at verse 13. And this is a pivotal section of Scripture. In Mark, this is actually the climax of the Gospel of Mark, because everything from this then goes into Matthew. It's sort of, but not really. It's not as... Mark is much more action-oriented. Matthew's much more teaching-oriented. Matthew's going to still put in a lot more teaching after this. But the question is, who do people say Jesus is? Who do people say Jesus is? And so let's talk about that this morning. As us today, 21st century Americans, in our daily walks, in our daily life, who do people say Jesus is? A prophet. That's one you'll hear a lot. That he was a prophet. That's what Jewish people believe. That's what a lot of Muslims believe. That he was a prophet. Anybody else? What else? What else do we hear about Jesus? Who is Jesus? Messiah. Absolutely Messiah. That's of course what Christians believe. Good teacher, Son of God. Okay, the Son of God is right along with Messiah. Yes, that's what Christians believe, and so a lot of people say that. A lot of people say good teacher. That he was a guy and he taught things and they were good teachings and things you ought to live by, but not necessarily the Son of God or whatever. What else? Anybody else? Wait. A martyr, a rebel, absolutely. He shook up the system. He came in and did things that nobody else had done before, and so much so that he's killed for it. What else? Who do people say Jesus is? Savior. Very good. That's again, what's that? That's what we say. But we're people too, and so I'm down with that. But anything else? Have you heard people say that he's a myth? Have you heard that? If you haven't, you will, because that's one of the new buzz things that the younger generation is dealing with, and not just them, but a lot of... I don't want to sound like a grumpy old get off my lawn man, but...
Even though history shows that he actually...
Yeah, and we'll get into that in a minute, but we don't want to read. Jesus asked in our text, who do you say that I am? Matthew 16. Let's read verse 13 through 16. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. What about you, he asked. Who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Who do we say Jesus is? That question is really it's really the question that we ask. We have to ask ourselves as far as our relationship to the Bible, to the New Testament, to Christianity. Who is Jesus? It may be that well, it not maybe it is. It's going to be a life-changing decision as to what we believe Jesus is. Who is he? And that's the point of this right here is that the answer, my answer individually to this question is it's going to change my life. I mean, I'm either going to believe that Jesus is the Son of God or not. The question of identity is one that's at the center of all the Gospels. If you walk through there in both the narrative accounts and the explicit identifications, the Gospels weave together a number of different portraits of Jesus. It's like the old adage about the elephant and the blind guys, and they're all looking at it from different directions. But the Gospels are not just interested in saying this is who Jesus is, that Jesus is the Christ. That's the point. But they're interested in giving you a much more clear picture of who he is in total. And so the question of identity is not just central to the gospel story, not just central to the scripture, but it's central to our faith. The question of identity is central to our faith. Who is Jesus? Yes, ma'am.
You know, as you look at this, it is amazing what Peter said. Because I don't think the Jews believed that the Messiah was going to be the Son of God.
Mm-hmm.
That this is a new concept.
It's a new concept. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I think that's why Jesus says this was not revealed to you by man. Because this is not something that any Jew at the time could have rationally made a leap to. If you would have asked them, who is the Messiah? They would have described to you that this military leader, this guy like David, who would be anointed and who would come up and he would overthrow the Roman rule and bring the Jews back to this place of prosperity and significance in the world. That's what they believed the Messiah was going to be. Nobody at that time would have said, oh, he'll be the Son of the living God. And like I say, there are people today who will say Jesus is a prophet, he was a teacher, he was a rabbi, he was a great man who taught truths to live by. The problem with all of those hypotheses is Jesus himself. Because all those are okay until you put Jesus himself into it. Because Jesus shatters all of those by his own words. Jesus says, I and the Father are one. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. Those are all claims of deity. That's claiming to be God. And so, good teacher, prophet, a good man who extolled virtues to live by, maybe, but once you bring Jesus himself and his own words into it, all those things go away, and you're back to the question that C.S. Lewis famously poses, that when we answer who Jesus is, he's either got to be a lunatic, a liar, or the Lord. He can't be anything else, because he thinks he's God. He thinks he and the Father are one. He thinks no one comes to the Father except through him. He thinks before Abraham was, I am. That's saying that's putting yourself in connection with the name of God. And so he's either nuts, and you know, my family used to tell a story, because there was a guy who was walking around Jasper for about a day and a half. At one point, he was wearing a robe, and then at some point, he lost the robe and was just totally naked. But he was walking around knocking on doors, telling people he was Jesus. And so, but that's that's what we're dealing with. If you can't say, well, that guy's a good teacher. No, that guy's crazy. And so he's either a lunatic or he's something worse. He's a liar. He's trying to present himself as something he is not. And so if he is presenting himself as the Son of God, as the Messiah, and he's not, and he knows it, he's not crazy, well, now he's a liar. Now he's much more nefarious. Now he's much more, he's something different. Or he is who he says he is. I mean, that's really the only way we can answer this question. There will be the people, like I said before, who, I have met people now in my life well, y'all don't understand this. There's a moment, when you go, we like to go on cruises, right? And so when we're on a cruise, you get put with other people that you don't know. And you start the conversation, da-da-da-da-da, and you talk about your kids, you talk about where you live, and you talk about this and that. And inevitably, eventually, the question comes. And Hillary will tell you she winces when they say, and so, Jeff, what do you do? Because at that moment, one of two things happens. I say, well, I'm a preacher, or I'm a minister, or whatever, but I tell them what I do. They either... y'all don't understand. You physically see people take a step back. Like I'm not joking with you. I'm not kidding. I've watched them do it. Or you see people just, okay, well, good to meet y'all. Have a great day. I mean, literally, they run because they don't want anything to do with that. The other one is that they want to ask me all the questions they've always wanted to ask but never had the opportunity to ask. And so Hillary will tell you there's been nights when she's woken up on a cruise in her room without me and went, where is he? And she's found me on some deck talking to people about God because they ask me questions and I just can't not do that. That's just part of who I am. I'm not trying to say, look how great Jeff is. I'm just saying that people, when they get to that point, they want to ask you. And one of the things that you come across is people say, well, Jesus didn't really exist. His disciples made him up. His disciples made him up, and they crafted him around all these other myths of the time, and then they just made him fit all of these things. And I very kindly say, you don't really read much, do you? I don't say it like that because that's rude, but that's what I'm saying, because there's no way you can come to that conclusion if you look at the scope of history. Let me give you just a few things, okay? You've almost, if you've been in church for any length of time, you've heard a preacher talk about a guy named Josephus. Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian who was living within the time, not long after the time of Christ, and he writes about Jesus on multiple occasions. He is not a believer. He's a Jewish historian. He's not a Christian. But as he writes about Christians, he writes about the fact that there was this guy who lived. There are two Roman historians, Pliny and Tacitus. Sorry, I'm not real good with that. But these two guys are Roman historians, both of them secular, both of them not believers. In fact, Tacitus extremely dislikes Christians. But both of them write about this man, Jesus, and the movement that he created. There are multiple other sources that we could go into, and I'm not going to bore you to death. That's a whole nother class. But there's a ton of sources. One of the things that I always come back to is that we have literally more historical evidence for the reality of Jesus than we do for Plato or Socrates or a lot of other ancient figures that people take at face value. There's very little historical evidence that any of these people actually existed. There's much more historical evidence that there was a guy named Jesus who existed in the first century who led a movement among first century Palestine. So, Palestine, I'm from Texas. Palestine, sorry. East Texas. Anyway, I'm sorry. Here we go. But the point is that whole argument doesn't hold water. And we could go through a whole lot of things and talk about a bunch of studies and a bunch of, things. There's archaeologists that have studied the graves. There's archaeologists that have studied first century burial procedures. There are, there's no way that, we get into the disciples made it up. First of all, there's no evidence anywhere in the Gospels that the disciples had a backbone at all, let alone any imagination. They barely knew what Jesus was talking about most of the time when he's talking to them directly. And if you were going to make up a story, most people who make up a story and include themselves in it don't portray themselves as the dummies who didn't know what Jesus was talking about. Make sense? Also, in that culture, the first people who witnessed the resurrection are women. There's no way in that culture you would want a woman to be your primary witness. Women's testimony were not even allowed in Roman courts. And so why would you do that? That you're already shooting yourself in the foot. And so if you're going to make this up, there's so many other things like that we could go through that if you're going to make stuff up, you wouldn't have made it up this way. Does that make sense? And so we go through all that stuff. There's all kinds of archaeologists and historians and blah, 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 and I won't bore you to death with that. But it brings us back to this question, who do you say Jesus is? And so Jesus is really like, why are you following me? You know, what are you here for? What he says, who do people say I am? What's the buzz on the street? And they tell him, well, some people think you're John the Baptist reincarnated, and that you're going around and doing the same thing he was doing, baptizing and saying repent for the kingdom's at hand. That's all John the Baptist type stuff. Other people say that you're Elijah or Jeremiah or one of the prophets. You're a reincarnated prophet. But nobody is making the jump to you're the Messiah. Jesus says, why are you guys giving up everything to follow me? And as Miss Pat pointed out, Peter's confession is a dramatic leap for anybody. And there's no way, as Jesus says, that he came to that on his own, because nobody would have believed that the Messiah was the Son of God, that those were two different things. And so, I'm skipping ahead because I'm all over the place. Behind Peter's hope, behind Peter's declaration, is this idea of liberation. And what I mean by that is Peter's idea of a Messiah, even though he jumps to you're the Son of the living God, that he still is in this first century Jewish understanding of what a Messiah is going to do. We'll see that later on in the chapter. He doesn't totally get it, even though he's saying it. But behind his hope behind his declaration is this hope, this political expectation that the Messiah is going to overthrow the Roman Empire, this empire that is ruling over the Jewish people, this empire that is wielding power over them and keeping them underfoot, so to speak. And there's a little bit of an excitement in there. I see Peter jumping up, like it's something he can't wait to say. And here's why I bring this up, because I think somehow the church, we've lost some of that excitement. That the excitement that the Messiah is here to overthrow empires. So let me ask this question. Let's talk about this for a minute. Are there still empires that are crushing or oppressing people all around us. Now, I'm not just talking about political empires. And so you're going to say, well, yeah, there's dictators here and there. I'm talking about both physical, political, spiritual, metaphoric empires that are crushing people. Are there still empires? And what are some of those empires, Jason? There's not a correct. I'm asking your opinion, so you can't be wrong. Okay. Right. Jason says Iran, for those of you at home, not that he ran, he would like to, but he's not yet. But the kingdom or the country of Iran, that their people are very oppressed. Humanism. Okay, now we're getting into some more metaphor. Unpack that a little bit. Tell us what you mean by humanism.
Well, I've heard it so much of my life, I don't know that I've ever heard it totally defined. But my idea is that man makes his own, man is the most important creation. No, not creation. They don't believe in creation. But man is the most important thing, and he makes his own future, makes his own.
Yes.
It's the pull yourself up by the bootstraps philosophy.
Trust your gut,
Yeah.
right? And live your own truth. That's the one you'll hear a lot nowadays. That truth is relative to each individual.
Take care of people, not because of your belief in God,
Right.
but because you are a human, kind
Yes.
person.
Yes. No. That's good. Humanism. And the problem with that, how is that oppressing people?
It's
Denigrate.
God.
Okay. It denigrates God. I would make the case too that there's no hope in that. I mean, you're basically saying that there was nothing in space, and then all of a sudden the nothing blew up, and then we had animals. And then those animals became people, and now those people are the most important things in the universe until they die, and then they're nothing. I mean, am I the only one that sees that as a little bit hopeless, dark? I don't understand. I mean, we look at people today, and why are people so depressed? Well, why wouldn't you be if that's all you got to live for?
That's why the fear of death is so strong.
The fear of death, absolutely, because there's, What else? Anybody else? Can you think of another empire that is metaphoric or literal or whatever? I don't care. Another empire that's oppressing people today. China. Very good. China is, we could go on with that one for a long time, right? And there's a lot going on. I don't follow it enough to know everything, but I know some of y'all do, and we could talk about that for a long time. But there are a lot of those, right? I mean, what other? There's a bunch of dictators and Ooh, okay. Steve said political correctness. That you can't say this or that, and you can't do this or that, and you don't want to offend anybody. And okay, I buy that's an oppressive regime. To use our metaphor. What would it mean to call Jesus the Messiah, okay, the one who's going to overthrow empires, in light of this kind of context? Both physical empires, we talked about Iran, we talked about China, and metaphoric empires, humanism, or whatever. How does calling Jesus the Messiah interact with those things? How does that change that oppression? Evan? Something's up. that there were several thousand years of tradition and ritual and all these things that the Jewish people were clinging to, and you're going to throw all that away, because of this one guy. That's a bigger deal. What else? How does calling Jesus the Messiah reflect on the empires that are oppressing people today, or does it? Maybe you say, no, it doesn't really have any effect. Say that again. Some empires, you're telling them that they're wrong. You're telling them that what they're doing is wrong. But it's interesting, though. Well, no, let's not. Jason, go ahead. Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. The empires of today, even though they may give lip service to Jesus, they don't necessarily reflect that in the way they behave. Kevin? Mm-hmm. Right. Ahead of the state. Absolutely. And so those kind of communist governments are trying to eradicate any kind of religion, whether it be burning Bibles or Quran or whatever. They don't want that in there, because that gives you something else that's above the state, and the state should be the top thing. Jason? Right. Right. That just the fact that you are owning the scripture of any kind, but you could be tortured, put in jail. South Korea, is it North Korea, is really bad. I mean, you read some of the stories coming out of there, and then a lot of the Taliban countries. It's really scary. You read some of that, but then there's also the metaphoric things that we talk about in here, right here among us. Stephen talked about political correctness and this idea of that there is this. Need to not offend anybody, and that is more important than any other kind of truth, and that ideology becomes more important than anything else, and there's a lot of other ones we can dig into. This is the time, and we'll see in the next section. We stopped before he really did it. Jesus answers in verse 17. And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." So this is a big enough deal that Jesus changes Peter's name. From now on, you're going to be known as the Rock, not the wrestler, but you're going to be known as the Rock. I guess he's more a movie star now than a wrestler. That joke is not. But anyway, you know what I'm talking about. But from now on, you're going to be known as the Rock, and that on this rock. And I am going to build my church. There's generations of debate revolving around the identification of the rock upon which Jesus will build the church. And we're not going to get into that here because that's a whole nother class that will take forever. But the question is that the idea is that there is power in the faith, that there is a power that resonates not just in the earthly realm, but in the spiritual realm. And Jesus says that confession, that understanding, that faith connects the two and brings those two together. And so the question then is how we might see that power working in our midst. Our tendency, I think, is to look at the spectacular and the stunning to see God's work. You know, we talk about the magnificent things and we talk about the big things, but what if God's power and God's work is much more subtle than fireworks? You know, that it's not just the big thing. What if the simple assertion that Jesus is the Messiah is more powerful but quieter than the clanging gongs of the empire, whatever that empire is? It's telling that the word church is used here. The term occurs regularly in the rest of the New Testament, but Matthew 16:18 and 18:17 are the only occurrences of the word church found in the Gospels, period. I found that interesting. The word church appears Paul uses it all the time. He talks about it all the time. In the Gospels, among the life and the words of Jesus, 2 times the word church is used. And this is one of them. So there's something here. Upon this rock. What is this rock? Well, you know, like I said, there's a lot of debate. I'm going to give you my opinion, and because I have the microphone, and we're not going to talk about the other opinions. But I think the rock here is not Peter. It's not that somehow Peter's lineage is going to somehow create a church. It's not a man. The rock is that confession. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. That foundation is what the church is going to be built on. And there's a lot of things that we draw out from that, because upon this rock, upon this confession of faith, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, I am going to build my church, my assembly, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. We forget that one. I talk to people, I've been in churches where you had people that I call gatekeepers. You know, they're defenders of the faith, and they have to protect the church from all the heresies and all this stuff. You don't need that. Jesus says the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And so when we stand up and say, well, we've got to protect the church from all this stuff, that's a statement of a lack of faith. That's saying, I don't trust that God can take care of his own business. He needs me to take care of it for him. I'm sorry. I know that's hurtful to some people, and people get mad at me for saying that. But Jesus says it right here. On this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. It's not going to be swayed. It's not going to be beat up. And so then he says this community, this church, this assembly is going to be given the keys of the kingdom. And whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And so then you've got to ask yourself, as a church, as a church of followers of this Messiah, this Son of the living God, how are we doing that? How are we binding on earth and binding in heaven? How are we loosing on earth and loosing in heaven? How is the church of this Messiah able to stand against the empires of today? And now I'm talking a little bit more in a spiritual, metaphorical sense. I don't expect the church to go charge China. But I do expect the church to stand against some of the empires that are oppressing people today. And that means across all the lines. Because I'm gonna step off in it right now. I should roll my pants up. But one of the empires that are oppressing people in America today is politics. Because regardless of which side of the aisle you're on, there are people who their party and their voting preference is more important than the gospel of Jesus Christ. I know, I said it. I'm not supposed to say that in church. But it's true. There are people who will throw away everything that they believe and everything that they hold dear because we've got to advance the party. And I'm sorry, that's an ungodly empire. That needs a Messiah to stand against it. That needs a Messiah to tear it down and to say, that's not what we're here for. The United States of America is not the kingdom of heaven. And so when we try to recreate it as such, we're stepping off in a place that we don't belong. The church is supposed to be liberating and loosing. The church is supposed to be bringing freedom. The actual idea is that in this identity that our mission, the church becomes the vehicle for the mission of Christ's kingdom. What does that mean? If the church is the vehicle for the mission of Christ's kingdom, what does that mean? This community is endowed with the keys of the kingdom. You will be given the keys of the kingdom. What you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. What you loose on earth will be bound in heaven. We, the church, are given the power of forgiveness. And we've made that such an individualistic thing, but that's not. We, as the church, are given the authority to offer forgiveness of sins. No, we don't give forgiveness of sins. I don't do that. I can't offer you absolution. That's not Jeff's job. But Jesus does. But we as the church are the vehicle for that. Does that make sense? That's our job. And that's a pretty amazing thing, that we're given that authority, that we're given that power, that we're given the keys to the kingdom of heaven. But we've lost sight of that. And we get to arguing about stupid things. And I mean, you know, and you all been around church long enough, most of you, that you know what I'm talking about. We argue about all kind of stupid things. And we'll get into squabbles and about everything. And all those things, how can we as a church better exercise the power of forgiveness and better utilize the keys of the kingdom that we've been given? Now, that's not a question we're going to solve in 2 minutes. But it's a question for us to think about the rest of the week. Because when we come back, we're going to talk about, we're not finished with this yet, we're going to talk about the new identity. That when we come into contact with Jesus, Peter's not the only one who gets a new identity. You and I get a new identity. When we come into contact and declare Jesus as Messiah, it changes who we are. It should. And if it doesn't, maybe we're still somewhere out here. And how does the church become a vehicle for offering the forgiveness to a lost and dying world? How does the church become a vehicle for a Messiah to tear down empires? How does the church become a vehicle for liberation to those who are oppressed? How does the church become this thing that Jesus is saying we're going to become? That's a lot, and we're out of time. And so I'm going to leave that for now. Take that. I like to call it marinate. Marinate that for a week. And we'll pick up there when we come back next Sunday, because I think that's something that gives us a lot to think about for a week. And so when we come back together next Sunday, we'll start right here in Matthew 16, and we'll start by talking about that question. How does the church, as the vehicle of the Messiah, bring about offering that power of forgiveness to a lost and dying world? So, thank you for your participation this morning. Thank you for being here. You got about 15 minutes. Fellowship, take care of your business. Be back in here at 10 o'clock for worship. Thank you.